Sarah Chen stood in the cramped living room of her family's apartment, her single suitcase by the door, and her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn furniture that had been in the same spots for as long as she could remember. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," her older brother Kevin said from the couch, not bothering to look up from his phone. "Moving to Los Angeles with no job, no connections, and some ridiculous dream about making movies. You'll be back here in 6 months broke and embarrassed." Her sister Lisa nodded in agreement from the kitchen doorway. "Sarah, be realistic. You just graduated with a film degree that's basically worthless. Do you know how many people move to Hollywood every year thinking they're gonna make it? Thousands. And 99% of them end up waiting tables or moving back home." Their mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression a mixture of concern and disappointment. "Sweetheart, your father and I just think you should be more practical. Kevin has a good job at the insurance company, Lisa is doing well in accounting. There are opportunities here. Why risk everything on something so uncertain?" Sarah had heard these arguments for months, ever since she'd announced her plans to move to Los Angeles after graduation. Her family lived in a small Rust Belt city where the biggest employer was a manufacturing plant that had been laying people off for years. The safe, practical choice was to find a local job, settle down, and accept the limitations of their circumstances. But Sarah had dreams that felt bigger than her hometown. Ever since she was 12 and made her first short film with her dad's old camcorder, she had known she wanted to tell stories that mattered. She wanted to create movies that made people think, feel, and see the world differently. "I know it's risky," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the doubt she saw in her family's eyes. "But I also know that if I don't try now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I'd rather fail at something I care about than succeed at something that doesn't matter to me." Her father, who had been silent during the family discussion, finally spoke from his recliner. "Sarah, dreams don't pay bills. I worked at the plant for 30 years to provide for this family. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. This Hollywood nonsense is just that, nonsense." Kevin laughed, shaking his head. "Dad's right. You're going to spend all your savings, probably end up in debt, and for what? So you can say you tried? That's not going to help you when you're 30 and have nothing to show for it." The words stung because Sarah knew there was truth in them. She had saved $3,000 from her part-time jobs during college, barely enough to cover a deposit and first month's rent in Los Angeles. She didn't have a job lined up, didn't know anyone in the industry, and was moving to one of the most expensive cities in the country with no safety net except her own determination. But something inside her refused to accept that this was foolish. Every time she watched a movie that moved her, every time she read about a filmmaker who had started with nothing and created something meaningful, she felt a pull that was stronger than her family's practical concerns. "I understand why you're worried," Sarah said, picking up her suitcase. "But I need you to understand that this isn't just a whim. I've been planning this for 2 years. I've researched the industry, saved money, and I have a plan." Lisa rolled her eyes. "A plan? What plan? Show up in LA and hope someone discovers you?" Sarah took a deep breath. She had explained her strategy before, but her family had dismissed it as naive optimism. "I'm going to start by working as a production assistant on any project I can find. I'll learn the business from the ground up, make connections, and prove myself. I'm not expecting to direct movies immediately. I'm willing to work my way up." "Work your way up to what?" Kevin challenged. "Do you have any idea how competitive that industry is? There are people with connections, money, and experience who don't make it. What makes you think you're special?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah realized it was the heart of her family's skepticism. They couldn't understand why she believed she could succeed when so many others had failed. They saw her confidence as arrogance and her dreams as delusions. "I don't think I'm special," Sarah said finally. "I think I'm determined. I think I'm willing to work harder than most people. And I think I have something to say that people need to hear. Maybe that's not enough, but it's all I have, and I'd rather bet on myself than settle for a life I don't want." Her mother's expression softened slightly. "Oh, honey, we just don't want to see you get hurt. The world can be cruel to dreamers." "I know," Sarah said, hugging her mother. "But it can also be amazing to people who are brave enough to chase what they want." As she said goodbye to each family member, Sarah could see the mixture of love, concern, and skepticism in their faces. They thought she was making a terrible mistake, but they also recognized that she was an adult making her own choices. Malin. Kevin was the last to speak. When this doesn't work out, and you need help getting back on your feet, just remember that we told you so. Don't expect us to bail you out of a mess you created. His words were meant to sting, and they did. But they also strengthened Sarah's resolve. She was tired of being seen as the impractical dreamer, the family member who didn't understand how the real world worked. She was going to prove them wrong, not out of spite, but because she genuinely believed she could build the life she wanted. The first few months in Los Angeles were exactly as difficult as her family had predicted. Sarah rented a tiny studio apartment in a questionable neighborhood, sharing the space with cockroaches and the constant noise of traffic. Her savings dwindled quickly as she discovered that everything cost more than she had budgeted for. She spent her days applying for production assistant jobs, often competing with hundreds of other applicants for positions that paid barely above minimum wage. Many of the job postings required experience she didn't have, or connections she couldn't provide. Her nights were spent at coffee shops and libraries, writing scripts and editing sample reels on her laptop. She submitted her work to contests, applied for grants, and reached out to anyone who might be willing to look at her projects. The rejections came constantly. Form letters thanking her for her interest, but informing her that they had chosen someone else. Contest entries that disappeared into black holes. Emails that went unanswered. During this period, Sarah's family called regularly, their concern thinly veiling their expectation that she would admit defeat and come home. Kevin would ask pointed questions about her finances. Lisa would share job openings in their hometown. Their parents would hint that her old bedroom was still available. "How's the Hollywood dream going?" Kevin asked during one particularly difficult week when Sarah had been turned down for 3 different PA positions. "It's going," Sarah replied, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much she was struggling. "That doesn't sound very convincing. Are you actually making any money yet?" Sarah looked around her tiny apartment, at the ramen noodles that had become her primary food source and the rejection letters scattered on her desk. "I'm building something. It takes time." Building what, exactly? Debt? The conversation ended with Sarah feeling more discouraged than ever. Maybe her family was right. Maybe she was being naive and stubborn, refusing to admit that she had made a mistake. But the next morning, something shifted. Sarah realized that she had been approaching her job search too passively, waiting for opportunities to appear, rather than creating them herself. She began researching independent filmmakers, student projects, and low-budget productions that might need help. She started volunteering on film sets, working for free in exchange for experience and connections. The work was exhausting. 12-hour days carrying equipment, organizing paperwork, and doing whatever tasks needed to be done. But she was finally inside the industry, learning how movies were actually made. Her first paid job came through a connection she made while volunteering on a music video. The director needed someone to help coordinate a small commercial shoot, and Sarah's enthusiasm and reliability had impressed him during their previous collaboration. The pay was minimal, but it was her first professional credit in Los Angeles. More importantly, it led to other opportunities. The director recommended her to other filmmakers. And slowly, Sarah began building a reputation as someone who was reliable, hardworking, and creative. Within 6 months, she was working regularly as a production assistant and coordinator. The jobs were still demanding and the pay was modest, but she was learning constantly and making connections throughout the industry. Her family's phone calls during this period reflected their continued skepticism, though now mixed with confusion about why she hadn't given up yet. "Are you actually making enough money to live on?" Lisa asked during one call. "I'm covering my expenses," Sarah replied, which was mostly true, though she was still living very frugally. "But what's your long-term plan? You can't be someone's assistant forever." Sarah had been thinking about this question herself. She was gaining valuable experience, but she knew she needed to start creating her own projects if she wanted to move beyond support roles. She began using her industry connections to develop her own short films. Working with friends she had met on various sets, Sarah wrote, directed, and produced a series of small projects that showcased her storytelling abilities. Her first short film was about a young immigrant working in a restaurant. struggling to balance her traditional family's expectations with her own aspirations. The story drew from her own experience of feeling caught between family obligations and personal dreams. The film was made for less than $2,000, using borrowed equipment and volunteer actors. But Sarah poured everything she had learned about filmmaking into the project, and the result was something that felt authentic and emotionally powerful. She submitted the film to festivals, not expecting much but hoping to get feedback from industry professionals. To her surprise, the film was accepted into several regional festivals and received positive reviews from critics who praised its emotional honesty and technical craftsmanship. The festival screenings led to meetings with producers and managers who were interested in Sarah's work. For the first time since moving to Los Angeles, she felt like she was being seen as a filmmaker, rather than just someone who worked on other people's projects. One of these meetings changed everything. A producer who had seen her short film was developing a low-budget feature about family dynamics and thought Sarah would be the perfect director. The project had modest financing, but would give Sarah her first opportunity to direct a full-length movie. When she called her family to share the news, their reactions were mixed. There was genuine excitement about her opportunity, but also continued skepticism about whether this would lead to sustainable success. "That's great, honey," her mother said. "But is this going to be a real career or just another project?" "It's a real movie, Mom, with real actors and a real budget. This could change everything for me." Kevin's response was more direct. "What happens if this movie doesn't work out? Are you going to keep chasing these projects forever? Or are you going to eventually get a real job?" His question frustrated Sarah because she felt like her family still didn't understand that filmmaking was her real job. She had been working constantly, building skills and relationships, and slowly climbing the industry ladder. But because her path didn't look like traditional employment, they continued to see it as an extended hobby. The feature film production was the most challenging and rewarding experience of Sarah's life. As director, she was responsible for every creative decision, from working with actors to coordinating with the cinematographer, to managing the complex logistics of a month-long shoot. There were moments of crisis when equipment failed, when actors got sick, when weather disrupted outdoor scenes. But there were also moments of pure creative joy, when a scene came together perfectly, when an actor delivered a performance that exceeded everyone's expectations, when the team collaboratively solved problems that had seemed impossible. When the film wrapped, Sarah felt like she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer someone trying to become a filmmaker. She was a filmmaker who had successfully completed a feature film. The movie was accepted into several prestigious film festivals, including one of the major international festivals that could launch careers. Sarah's work received critical praise, with reviewers noting her ability to create authentic, emotionally complex characters and her sophisticated understanding of visual storytelling. More importantly, the festival screenings led to distribution deals and industry recognition that established Sarah as an emerging talent worth watching. Agents and managers who had ignored her emails were now calling to schedule meetings. During this period, Sarah's relationship with her family began to shift. The tangible success of having a film in major festivals was something they could understand and appreciate in ways that her previous work had not been. "I saw the review in Variety," Lisa called to tell her. "They called you a filmmaker to watch. That's amazing, Sarah." Even Kevin, who had been the most skeptical about her choices, seemed impressed by the industry recognition she was receiving. "I have to admit, I didn't think this would actually work out for you. But it seems like you might actually know what you're doing." The success of her first feature led to opportunities that exceeded Sarah's original dreams. She was offered development deals with established production companies, invited to direct episodes of television series, and approached by actors who wanted to work with her on future projects. Within 2 years of her first feature, Sarah was working on her second film with a significantly larger budget and high-profile cast. The project was a thriller that explored themes of identity and belonging, drawing from her experience of feeling like an outsider in various communities. By this time, Sarah was earning more money than anyone in her family, though she was careful not to make this fact obvious during their conversations. She had learned that her success could be threatening to people who had invested in the narrative that her choices were foolish. But the financial reality was undeniable. Sarah was earning six-figure directing fees, had royalty agreements that provided ongoing income, and was building wealth through smart investments in property and production companies. Meanwhile, her family's financial situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The manufacturing plant where her father had worked for 3 decades had finally closed, eliminating hundreds of jobs, including his. Kevin's insurance company was downsizing, and he was facing the possibility of layoffs. Lisa's accounting firm had been struggling with competition from automated services and online platforms. The economic stability that had seemed so secure compared to Sarah's risky career choices was proving to be an illusion. The industries and employers that had provided steady work for previous generations were disappearing, leaving her family members scrambling to adapt to changing economic realities. Sarah learned about her family's difficulties gradually, through careful listening during phone calls and conversations with relatives. Her parents were struggling with medical bills and reduced income. Kevin was stressed about job security and mortgage payments. Lisa was working longer hours for less pay as her firm tried to remain competitive. None of them asked Sarah for help directly, but she could hear the worry in their voices and the strain in their relationships as financial pressure mounted. The contrast between her situation and theirs was stark. While they were dealing with economic uncertainty and declining prospects, Sarah was choosing between multiple high-paying projects and building a career that offered both creative fulfillment and financial security. She began quietly helping her family in ways that wouldn't threaten their pride. She paid for her parents' medical expenses, anonymously covered Kevin's mortgage payments during a difficult period, and invested in Lisa's efforts to start her own accounting practice. But the most significant moment came when her father called her directly, something he rarely did. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I need to ask you for something, and it's not easy for me to admit." She could hear the difficulty in his voice and knew what was coming. "The house is in foreclosure. Your mother and I have been trying to manage the payments since I lost my job, but we're behind on everything. I know you're doing well out there, and I was wondering if you might be able to help us with a loan, just until we get back on our feet." The request was humble and heartbreaking. The man who had dismissed her dreams as impractical was now asking for financial help from the daughter whose career choices he had criticized. "Dad," Sarah said gently, "of course I'll help, and it's not a loan. I'm going to take care of the house payments. You and Mom shouldn't have to worry about losing your home." There was silence on the other end of the line, and she could hear her father struggling with emotion. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed. "I was so wrong about everything. About your choices, about your career, about what was practical and what wasn't." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. She had wanted to prove her family wrong, but she hadn't wanted them to suffer in the process. "You weren't wrong to worry about me," she said. "You were trying to protect me from disappointment and failure. I understand that now. But I'm glad I took the risk, and I'm glad I can help you now." The conversation marked a fundamental shift in her family's understanding of success, security, and risk. The stable, practical careers they had encouraged her to pursue were proving to be vulnerable to economic changes beyond individual control. Meanwhile, the risky, impractical career she had chosen was providing not just creative fulfillment, but also the financial resources to help her family during their time of need. Over the following months, Sarah continued supporting her family while they navigated career transitions and economic difficulties. She helped Kevin start a consulting business that utilized his insurance expertise in new ways. She provided capital for Lisa's accounting practice and helped her develop marketing strategies that attracted clients looking for personalized service rather than automated solutions. Her parents, with their mortgage concerns resolved, were able to focus on her father's job search and her mother's part-time work without the constant stress of potential homelessness. But perhaps most importantly, the family's relationship with Sarah changed fundamentally. They began asking for her advice on career decisions, recognizing that her experience building an unconventional career had given her insights that applied to their situations. "I never understood how you figured out how to make money doing what you love," Lisa said during one of their conversations. "I always thought you had to choose between following your passion and having financial security. But you found a way to do both." Sarah's success also became a source of inspiration for other young people in her hometown who had dreams that seemed impractical by local standards. She began receiving messages from high school students who wanted advice about pursuing careers in creative fields, technology, or entrepreneurship. She started making regular visits home, not just to see her family, but to speak at local schools and community organizations about alternative paths to success. Her message was always the same. The biggest risk might be playing it safe in a world that was changing faster than traditional career paths could adapt. During one of these visits, Sarah was invited to speak at her old high school's career day. Standing in the gymnasium where she had once felt like an outsider with unrealistic dreams, she looked out at an audience that included several of her former teachers and classmates. 10 years ago, many people in this room thought I was making a huge mistake, she began. I was leaving home with no job, no connections, and what seemed like an impossible dream. The practical advice was to stay local, get a steady job, and build a traditional career. She paused, looking at the faces in the audience, some of whom had given her that exact advice. But what I learned is that in a rapidly changing world, following your passion isn't just personally fulfilling, it can also be the most practical choice you can make. Industries change, companies disappear, but the ability to create value through your unique talents and perspectives is something that no one can take away from you. After her talk, several people approached her, including her former guidance counselor, who had discouraged her from pursuing film school. "I owe you an apology," the counselor said. "I gave you advice based on what had worked for previous generations, but I didn't understand how much the world was changing. You were ahead of your time, and I was behind it." These conversations reinforced for Sarah that her journey hadn't just been about personal success. It had been about proving that different approaches to career and life could work, even when they seemed risky or unconventional to others. As Sarah's career continued to flourish, she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She announced that she was moving her production company back to her hometown, bringing jobs and investment to the community that had once seemed to offer no opportunities for someone with her ambitions. The decision was both practical and emotional. Los Angeles had served its purpose in launching her career, but she realized she could create meaningful work anywhere, and she wanted to demonstrate that success didn't require abandoning your roots. The production company brought dozens of jobs to her hometown, from technical positions to administrative roles, to creative opportunities for local talent. Sarah hired several family members and former classmates, creating a business that served both her professional goals and her desire to contribute to her community. Her father, who had struggled to find work after the plant closure, became the production company's facilities manager, overseeing the conversion of an old warehouse into a state-of-the-art film studio. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that he was now working for the daughter whose career choices he had once considered impractical. "You know what's funny?" he said to Sarah during the studio's opening celebration. "I spent 30 years trying to teach you about being practical and responsible. But you ended up teaching me that sometimes the most practical thing you can do is follow your dreams." Sarah's story became a local legend, but more importantly, it became an example of how individual success could create opportunities for entire communities. Young people in her hometown now had examples of creative careers that seemed possible rather than fantastical. The production company's success led to other creative businesses moving to the area, attracted by the lower costs and growing infrastructure for media production. What had once been a struggling Rust Belt community began transforming into a hub for independent filmmaking and creative industries. As Sarah entered her 30s, established as a successful filmmaker and business owner, she often reflected on the journey that had brought her from that cramped apartment where her family had laughed at her dreams to a position where she could create opportunities for others. The family dinners that now took place in the renovated farmhouse Sarah had bought for her parents were very different from those early conversations about her impractical career choices. Her siblings brought their children to visit Aunt Sarah's movie studio, and the kids grew up thinking that making movies was a normal job that people in their family did. Kevin, whose consulting business had thrived with Sarah's support and advice, often joked about their early conversations. "I used to think you were crazy for betting everything on yourself," he would say. "Now I realize I was crazy for betting against you." But the most meaningful validation came from her mother, who had worried most about Sarah's unconventional choices. During a quiet moment at one of these family gatherings, She pulled Sarah aside. "I need to tell you something," her mother said. "I'm proud of you, but not just because you became successful. I'm proud because you had the courage to be yourself when everyone else wanted you to be someone different. You taught us all that there are many different ways to build a good life." Sarah realized that her journey had been about more than proving her family wrong or achieving professional success. It had been about demonstrating that authentic success came from aligning your work with your values and talents, regardless of whether that alignment looked conventional to others. The boy who had been called too lazy for success and the girl who had been told her dreams were impractical shared a similar insight. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking the risk to become who you're meant to be. As Sarah continued building her career and expanding her business, she carried with her the knowledge that success wasn't just about individual achievement. It was about creating value for others and contributing to something larger than yourself. The family that had once laughed when she left home now understood that she hadn't just been chasing a dream. She had been building a future that was big enough to include all of them. The transformation of Sarah's hometown from a struggling Rust Belt community into a thriving creative hub didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without challenges that tested everything she had built. 3 years after establishing her production company in her hometown, Sarah faced her first major crisis that threatened not just her business, but the entire ecosystem she had helped create. The crisis began when a major streaming platform that had been funding several of her projects suddenly canceled all their agreements due to corporate restructuring. In a single phone call, Sarah lost nearly 60% of her projected revenue for the next 2 years. The cancellation would force her to lay off most of her staff and potentially close the studio that had become the cornerstone of her hometown's economic revival. The news hit the community hard. Local businesses that had grown up around the film industry, restaurants, hotels, equipment rental companies, were suddenly facing the loss of their primary customers. The young people who had moved back to town to work in the creative industries were looking at unemployment. The investors who had been attracted to the area by Sarah's success were questioning their commitments. But perhaps most difficult for Sarah was watching her family's reaction to the crisis. The old anxiety returned to their faces, the familiar worry that the unconventional path she had chosen was inherently unstable. During a tense family dinner, the underlying fears that had never fully disappeared came to the surface. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Kevin said, his voice filled with frustration rather than malice. "These creative industries are too unpredictable. One phone call and everything you've built could disappear." Lisa, who had become one of Sarah's most supportive advocates, looked conflicted. Maybe there's a way to diversify, to build something more stable alongside the film work? Even her parents, who had become her biggest champions, seemed shaken by the sudden reversal of fortune. Her father, who now managed the studio facilities, was facing the possibility of unemployment once again, just when he had found meaningful work that utilized his skills. "I don't want to say I told you so," he said quietly, "but this is why we worried about you building everything around one industry. It's just too risky." Sarah understood their concerns, but she also recognized something they didn't. This crisis was exactly the kind of challenge that could either destroy what she had built or make it stronger than ever. She had learned from her years in Los Angeles that the entertainment industry was cyclical and unpredictable, but that the underlying skills and relationships she had developed were transferable to other opportunities. Instead of panicking or laying off her staff immediately, Sarah gathered her team and proposed something unprecedented. They would use this crisis as an opportunity to reinvent their business model entirely. "We've been thinking too small," she told her assembled employees. "We've been positioning ourselves as a regional production facility serving outside clients. But we have the talent, equipment, and expertise to become a full-service creative agency that doesn't depend on any single client or industry." Her plan was ambitious and risky. Instead of just making films and television shows, they would expand into commercial advertising, corporate communications, virtual reality experiences, educational content, and digital marketing services. They would develop their own intellectual property rather than just producing content for others. They would create revenue streams that were more diverse and resilient than traditional entertainment industry work. The plan required significant investment and a leap of faith from everyone involved. Sarah had to convince her employees to accept temporary pay cuts while they retooled their operations. She had to persuade local investors to double down on their commitments, despite the apparent setback. Most challenging, she had to prove to her family and community that this wasn't desperation but strategic evolution. The first major test of the new business model came when Sarah pitched their services to a struggling local manufacturer that was trying to modernize its marketing and employee training programs. The company had been considering hiring expensive consultants from major cities, but Sarah proposed a comprehensive multimedia approach that would cost less while providing more personalized service. Her team created promotional videos that showcased the manufacturer's products in ways that highlighted their quality and craftsmanship. They developed training modules that used interactive media to teach complex manufacturing processes more effectively than traditional methods. They designed a digital marketing campaign that told the company's story as a family business with deep community roots. The project was hugely successful, resulting in increased sales for the manufacturer and demonstrating that Sarah's expanded business model could serve local clients in ways that created mutual benefit. Word spread quickly through the business community, and soon other local companies were requesting similar services. But the real breakthrough came when Sarah's team was approached by a major automotive company that was looking to create educational content about sustainable manufacturing. The project would be larger than anything they had previously undertaken, requiring them to coordinate with engineers, environmental scientists, and corporate executives to create sophisticated technical content. Sarah's background in filmmaking proved invaluable for translating complex technical information into compelling visual narratives. Her team's combination of creative skills and business understanding allowed them to propose solutions that the automotive company's previous vendors had never considered. The automotive project led to a series of corporate clients who were impressed by the team's ability to combine creative excellence with practical business understanding. Within 18 months of the streaming platform cancellation that had threatened to destroy her business, Sarah's company was more profitable and stable than it had ever been. But more importantly, the crisis had forced her to develop a business model that was truly innovative rather than just regionally successful. Instead of competing with Los Angeles and New York for traditional entertainment work, she had created something unique that leveraged her location and team's diverse capabilities. The success of the expanded business model attracted attention from business schools and economic development organizations that were studying how creative industries could revitalize struggling communities. Sarah was invited to speak at conferences about rural economic development, creative entrepreneurship, and alternative business models. During one such conference at a major university, Sarah was approached by Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, an economics professor who had been studying the long-term impact of creative industries on regional development. "What you've accomplished is remarkable," Dr. Rodriguez told her. "But I think you may not realize the broader implications of what you've created. You haven't just built a successful business. You've demonstrated a completely new model for how creative industries can function in post-industrial communities." Dr. Rodriguez proposed collaborating on a comprehensive study that would document Sarah's approaches and their impact, with the goal of creating a replicable model that other communities could adapt. The study would examine not just the economic effects of Sarah's work, but the social and cultural changes that had occurred in her hometown as a result of the creative industries ecosystem she had fostered. The research project, which took 2 years to complete, revealed impacts that even Sarah hadn't fully recognized. The presence of creative industries had attracted young families to move back to the area, reversing decades of population decline. Property values had increased, but not to the point of displacing longtime residents. Local schools were reporting higher graduation rates and increased interest in technology and media courses. Perhaps most significantly, the community had developed what Dr. Rodriguez called entrepreneurial confidence, a collective belief that innovative solutions to local problems were possible and achievable. Residents were starting their own businesses at higher rates, collaborating on community improvement projects, and approaching challenges with creativity rather than resignation. The study's findings were published in multiple academic journals and attracted attention from policymakers who were looking for strategies to revitalize rural communities. Sarah found herself testifying before congressional committees about rural economic development and consulting with state governments on creative economy initiatives. But the recognition that meant the most to her came from an unexpected source. During the study's publication celebration, her high school English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, approached her with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, I need to tell you something I've never told you," Mrs. Patterson said. "When you were in my class, I could see that you had something special, a way of seeing stories that other students didn't have. But I was afraid to encourage you too much because I didn't want you to be disappointed when the real world didn't appreciate your talents." She paused, composing herself. "I realize now that I was wrong. The real world desperately needs people like you, people who can see possibilities that others miss and have the courage to make them real. You didn't just succeed despite being different. You succeeded because you were different." These conversations with her former teachers and community members helped Sarah understand that her journey had been about more than personal and professional success. She had inadvertently become proof that individual authenticity and community prosperity could be mutually reinforcing rather than conflicting goals. This realization led to Sarah's next major initiative, the creation of what she called the Authentic Success Institute. Unlike traditional business incubators that focused primarily on scalable technology companies, the Institute would support entrepreneurs who were building businesses based on their unique talents, local assets, and community needs. The Institute's first cohort included a former coal miner who was developing sustainable energy solutions based on his deep understanding of industrial systems, a retired teacher who was creating educational games that made learning more engaging for struggling students, and a group of immigrant women who were building a catering business that celebrated their cultural heritage while serving local market needs. What made the Institute unique was its emphasis on what Sarah called values-based scaling. Instead of pushing every business to grow as large as possible as quickly as possible, the Institute helped entrepreneurs identify sustainable growth strategies that maintained their connection to purpose and community. The approach attracted attention from impact investors and social entrepreneurs who were looking for alternatives to traditional venture capital models. The Institute began receiving funding from foundations and investors who were interested in supporting business models that created both financial returns and positive social impact. One of the Institute's most successful early graduates was Marcus Williams, a former auto worker who had developed an innovative approach to urban agriculture that could produce fresh vegetables year-round in abandoned industrial buildings. Marcus's business model combined environmental sustainability with job creation and food security, addressing multiple community needs simultaneously. With the Institute's support, Marcus was able to scale his operation across multiple Rust Belt cities, creating hundreds of jobs, while providing fresh, affordable produce to communities that had been classified as food deserts. His success became a model for how industrial communities could transition to new economic activities that built on existing infrastructure and workforce capabilities. The Institute's success led to requests from other communities that wanted to establish similar programs. Sarah found herself consulting with rural communities, urban neighborhoods, and even international development organizations that were interested in adapting her approaches to different contexts. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of her work came when she was invited to give the commencement address at her alma mater's film school. Standing before an audience of graduating students who reminded her of her younger self, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from an uncertain graduate with big dreams to someone who was helping others create their own paths to meaningful success. 10 years ago, I sat where you're sitting today, she told the graduates. I was terrified, excited, and completely uncertain about whether I could make my dreams work in the real world. I had been told by people who loved me that I was being impractical, that I should choose security over passion, that the entertainment industry was too competitive and unpredictable for someone like me. She paused, looking at the eager faces in front of her. What I learned is that they were both right and wrong. They were right that the traditional path in this industry is extremely difficult and uncertain. But they were wrong about what that meant for my choices. The uncertainty and difficulty weren't reasons to avoid the industry. They were reasons to approach it differently. Sarah continued. I discovered that success doesn't come from competing for existing opportunities, but from creating new ones. It doesn't come from fitting into established systems, but from building better systems. And it doesn't come from choosing between following your passion and creating security. It comes from finding ways to do both. After her speech, Sarah was approached by several students who were facing similar doubts and family pressures that she had experienced. One student, Maria Santos, was particularly memorable. Maria was a talented filmmaker from a working-class family who was torn between pursuing her artistic ambitions and taking a stable job to help support her parents. "I feel like I'm being selfish for wanting to make movies when my family needs financial help," Maria confided to Sarah. "They've sacrificed so much for my education, and I feel like I owe it to them to choose a career that will provide immediate income." Sarah recognized herself in Maria's struggle and offered her an internship at the production company. But more than that, she shared her own experience of how following her authentic path had ultimately enabled her to help her family more than any traditional career could have. "The best thing you can do for your family is to become the most successful version of yourself," Sarah told her. "That might take longer than getting a regular job, but it will create much greater opportunities for everyone you care about." Maria's internship turned into a full-time position, and she became one of the Institute's most promising entrepreneurs, developing a nonprofit that used filmmaking to help immigrant families document and share their stories. Her work attracted national attention and grant funding that allowed her to support her family while pursuing meaningful creative work. Stories like Maria's reinforced Sarah's belief that individual authenticity and collective prosperity were not competing values, but complementary forces. The more people who were encouraged to develop their unique talents and pursue their genuine interests, the more innovative solutions and economic opportunities would be created for entire communities. This philosophy was put to its greatest test when Sarah was approached by a major Hollywood studio that wanted to acquire her production company. The offer was substantial, enough money to make Sarah financially secure for life and provide significant returns to all her investors and employees. But the acquisition would also mean relocating operations back to Los Angeles, dismantling the creative ecosystem she had built in her hometown, and returning to the traditional entertainment industry model she had moved beyond. The decision was complicated by the fact that many of her employees and investors saw the acquisition as validation of everything they had built together. Her family, who had learned to appreciate the stability of her diversified business model, were concerned about turning down such a significant financial opportunity. "This is exactly what we always hoped would happen for you," her mother said during a family discussion about the acquisition offer. "A major studio wants to buy your company. That means you've really made it." But Sarah had learned to distinguish between external validation and authentic success. The studio's interest in her company was based on the financial returns it was generating, not on the community impact or innovative business model that she considered its most important achievements. "I appreciate the recognition," Sarah told her family, "but I don't think selling to the studio would actually advance the things that matter most to me. I'd rather continue building something that creates ongoing value for our community than take a one-time payout that benefits only us." The decision to decline the acquisition offer was controversial among some of her stakeholders, but it also clarified Sarah's priorities and strengthened her commitment to the path she had chosen. Instead of selling to the studio, she used the acquisition interest to secure additional investment that allowed her to expand the institute and develop new programs. One of these new programs was particularly close to Sarah's heart, a scholarship and mentorship initiative for young people from working-class families who wanted to pursue careers in creative industries. The program provided not just financial support for education, but ongoing mentorship, networking opportunities, and business development assistance that helped participants navigate the challenges she had faced as a first-generation creative professional. The scholarship program attracted applications from young people across the country who were struggling with the same conflicts between family expectations and personal dreams that had once challenged Sarah. The stories in their applications were heartbreakingly familiar. Parents who worried that creative careers were impractical, siblings who didn't understand artistic ambitions, communities where success was defined by traditional metrics that didn't account for creative achievement. But the program also attracted attention from established industry professionals who wanted to contribute to developing more diverse and inclusive creative industries. Successful filmmakers, executives, and entrepreneurs began volunteering as mentors, creating a network that provided participants with authentic industry connections and guidance. One of the program's first graduates, a young man named David Chen, from a small farming community, exemplified the potential that Sarah was trying to nurture. David had been expected to take over his family's farm, but he was passionate about using technology to create immersive storytelling experiences. With the program's support, David developed a virtual reality project that allowed people to experience farming life and understand the challenges facing rural communities. The project won several technology awards and attracted investment that allowed David to start a company specializing in VR experiences for education and social impact. But perhaps most importantly, David's success helped his family understand that his technology interests weren't a rejection of their agricultural heritage, but a way to honor and share it with broader audiences. His VR farming experiences were being used in schools to teach urban students about agriculture and food production. Stories like David's validated Sarah's belief that authentic success created expanding circles of positive impact. When people were encouraged to develop their unique talents and pursue their genuine interests, they didn't just achieve personal fulfillment. They created value and opportunities that benefited others. This perspective influenced Sarah's approach to her next major project, the development of a documentary series that would tell the stories of unconventional entrepreneurs who were building businesses based on their authentic interests and community needs. The series, titled Beyond the Expected, featured profiles of people who had chosen paths that seemed impractical or risky to others, but had created meaningful success by staying true to their values and vision. Each episode explored not just individual achievement, but the broader impact of authentic entrepreneurship on communities and industries. One episode featured a former Wall Street executive who had left finance to become an organic farmer, eventually developing sustainable agriculture techniques that were being adopted internationally. Another profiled a group of former factory workers who had started a cooperative manufacturing business that produced furniture from reclaimed materials while providing worker ownership and profit sharing. But the episode that generated the most response told the story of Sarah's own family and community, documenting the transformation that had occurred when one person's authentic success created opportunities for an entire region. The series was distributed through multiple platforms, including the streaming service that had originally canceled Sarah's projects years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now in a position to negotiate distribution deals from a position of strength rather than dependence. More importantly, the series sparked conversations about alternative definitions of success and encouraged viewers to consider how their own authentic interests and talents might create value in unexpected ways. The positive response to Beyond the Expected led to Sarah being invited to speak at business schools, entrepreneurship conferences, and economic development summits around the world. Her message was always the same. Authentic success wasn't just personally fulfilling, it was economically productive and socially beneficial. But Sarah was careful not to let her growing reputation as a thought leader distract from her core work of creating opportunities and supporting others. She continued to prioritize her production company, the Institute, and her community commitments over speaking engagements and media appearances. This balance was tested when Sarah was offered her most prestigious opportunity yet, a position as creative director for a major technology company that was developing new forms of interactive entertainment. The role would involve moving to Silicon Valley and leading a team of hundreds of developers and designers working on cutting-edge projects. The offer was tempting not just because of the salary and prestige, but because it would allow Sarah to work on innovations that could shape the future of storytelling and entertainment. The technology company was developing platforms that could make creative tools accessible to millions of people who had never had opportunities to create professional quality content. But accepting the position would mean leaving the ecosystem she had spent years building and returning to the corporate structure she had worked to move beyond. It would mean prioritizing individual career advancement over community impact and collaborative success. After extensive consideration and consultation with her family, employees, and mentors, Sarah made a decision that surprised the technology company and reinforced her commitment to her chosen path. Instead of accepting the corporate position, she proposed a partnership that would allow her to contribute to the platform's development while maintaining her independence and community focus. The partnership arrangement allowed Sarah's team to develop content and applications for the technology company's platform while continuing to operate from their hometown base. It provided her with access to cutting-edge tools and global distribution while maintaining the creative control and community connection that had made her work meaningful. But perhaps most importantly, the partnership demonstrated that it was possible to engage with major corporate initiatives without being absorbed by them. Sarah was able to contribute her expertise and perspective to projects with global reach while staying true to the values and relationships that grounded her work. The success of this partnership model attracted attention from other entrepreneurs and communities that were looking for ways to participate in the global economy without sacrificing local identity and autonomy. Sarah began consulting with rural communities, urban neighborhoods, and international development organizations that wanted to develop similar approaches. One particularly meaningful project involved working with a group of Native American communities that were interested in using modern technology to preserve and share their cultural heritage. Sarah's team helped develop digital storytelling platforms that allowed elders to record traditional stories and teach cultural practices to younger generations. The project required Sarah to learn about different cultural values and communication styles, expanding her understanding of how authentic success might look different in different contexts, while maintaining common principles of respect for individual potential and community benefit. These cross-cultural collaborations reinforced Sarah's belief that the principles she had discovered through her own journey were universal, even though their application varied based on local circumstances and cultural values. As Sarah entered her 40s, she began thinking more systematically about legacy and long-term impact. The businesses and programs she had created were thriving, but she wanted to ensure they could continue evolving and adapting long after her direct involvement ended. She established what she called the Succession Laboratory, a program designed to identify and develop the next generation of leaders who could carry forward the work she had started, while adapting it to challenges and opportunities she couldn't anticipate. The laboratory brought together young entrepreneurs, creative professionals, and community leaders who shared Sarah's commitment to authentic success and collaborative impact. Participants worked on real projects while receiving mentorship and training in leadership, business development, and social innovation. One of the laboratory's first initiatives was developing a global network of authentic success hubs, local organizations in different communities that would provide resources and support for people pursuing unconventional paths to meaningful achievement. Each hub would be adapted to local conditions and cultural values, but all would share common principles: recognition of diverse forms of intelligence and talent, support for values-based entrepreneurship, and commitment to individual authenticity as a foundation for collective prosperity. The first international hub was established in partnership with a group of young entrepreneurs in rural Ireland who were working to revitalize traditional crafts and agricultural practices through modern marketing and distribution techniques. The second was created with social innovators in Detroit who were developing new approaches to urban farming and community development. But the hub that held special meaning for Sarah was established in collaboration with Maria Santos, her former intern who had become a successful social entrepreneur. Maria's hub focused specifically on supporting first-generation creative professionals from working-class families, providing the kind of support and guidance that Sarah wished had been available during her early struggles. The success of the hub network validated Sarah's belief that authentic success principles could be adapted to different contexts while maintaining their core effectiveness. Each hub was developing its own approaches and innovations while contributing to a broader movement of people who were choosing meaning over convention and collaboration over competition. As the network grew, Sarah found herself spending more time in an advisory role rather than direct management, a transition that felt natural and appropriate. She had learned that sustainable impact required building systems that could operate independently rather than depending on any single leader. This transition allowed Sarah to return to her original passion, storytelling. She began working on her most ambitious creative project yet, a feature film that would synthesize everything she had learned about authentic success, community transformation, and individual potential. The film, tentatively titled The Return, would tell the story of a young person who leaves their hometown to pursue dreams that seem impossible, eventually returning to create opportunities that transform their entire community. The narrative would draw from Sarah's own experience while creating a fictional story that could inspire others facing similar choices. But the film would be more than just entertainment. Sarah planned to use its production and distribution as a way to demonstrate new models for creative collaboration and community engagement. The film would be produced using a cooperative structure that shared profits with all participants, not just investors and above-the-line talent. Local communities would be involved not just as filming locations, but as creative collaborators, contributing their own stories and perspectives to the narrative. The distribution strategy would prioritize community screenings and educational use rather than just commercial theatrical release. The project attracted support from the filmmaker community, with established directors, actors, and technicians volunteering their time and expertise because they believed in its message and approach. The film became a proving ground for more equitable and collaborative approaches to creative production. But perhaps most meaningfully, the film provided Sarah with an opportunity to reflect on and synthesize her own journey, from an uncertain young woman leaving home with impossible dreams, to a leader who had created opportunities for thousands of others to pursue their own authentic paths to success. During production, Sarah often thought about the conversation with her family on the day she left for Los Angeles, the doubts, fears, and criticism that had motivated her to prove them wrong. She realized now that her family's concerns had been rooted in love and their own experiences of economic insecurity and limited opportunities. Her success hadn't been about proving them wrong so much as proving that different approaches to security and prosperity were possible. She had shown that following your authentic interests and values could be not just personally fulfilling but also economically productive and socially beneficial. The weekly family dinners that continued in her parents' home had evolved into celebrations of diverse forms of success and contribution. Kevin's consulting business was thriving by helping traditional companies adapt to changing markets. Lisa's accounting practice specialized in supporting small businesses and nonprofit organizations. Both had found ways to build meaningful careers that combined financial stability with personal satisfaction. Their children were growing up with very different assumptions about work and success than previous generations had held. They expected to find careers that matched their interests and values, and they saw entrepreneurship and creative problem-solving as normal responses to challenges rather than risky departures from conventional wisdom. But the most profound change was in Sarah's parents, who had become advocates for supporting young people's unconventional dreams. Her father, now in his 70s but still actively involved in managing the studio facilities, often spoke at local schools about the importance of believing in young people's potential, even when their goals seemed impractical. "I learned from my daughter that sometimes the most practical thing you can do is follow your dreams," he would tell students. "But you have to be willing to work harder than anyone expects and stay committed longer than anyone thinks is reasonable." Her mother had become a volunteer mentor through the scholarship program, working with young women who were facing family pressures to choose security over passion. Her own experience of learning to support Sarah's unconventional choices made her particularly effective at helping other families navigate similar conflicts. As filming on The Return concluded, Sarah reflected on how her story had become intertwined with the stories of hundreds of other people who had found the courage to pursue authentic success in their own contexts and communities. The girl who had left home with a suitcase and impossible dreams had created a movement that was helping others discover that the most impractical choice might be playing it safe in a world that rewarded innovation, authenticity, and creative problem-solving. Her family, who had once laughed when she left home with no job and no connections, now understood that she hadn't just been chasing personal success. She had been building a future that was large enough to include everyone who was brave enough to believe in their own potential. The premiere of The Return was held not in Los Angeles or New York, but in Sarah's hometown, in the very high school gymnasium where she had once felt like an outsider with unrealistic ambitions. The audience included family members, former classmates, current employees, scholarship recipients, and community members whose lives had been touched by the ecosystem of opportunities she had helped create. As the credits rolled and the audience erupted in applause, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion and anticipation. Her story had come full circle, but she knew it was also just beginning. The principles she had discovered and the systems she had built were now being carried forward by hundreds of others who were creating their own versions of authentic success. The family that had once worried about her impractical dreams now understood that she hadn't just succeeded despite taking risks. She had succeeded because she had been willing to bet on herself when no one else would, and in doing so, she had created a model that others could follow, adapt, and improve upon. Sarah's journey from a laughed-at dreamer to a community creator had proven that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply being authentically yourself and having the patience to build something meaningful around that authenticity. The world needed people who were willing to imagine and create alternatives to systems that weren't working, and Sarah had shown that such alternatives were not just possible, but profitable, sustainable, and beneficial for entire communities. As she stood in that gymnasium, surrounded by people whose lives had been changed by her willingness to take an impossible risk, Sarah knew that her greatest success wasn't the money she had earned or the recognition she had received. It was the proof that one person's authentic journey could create expanding circles of opportunity that would continue long after she was gone. The girl who had left home to pursue impossible dreams had returned to make those dreams possible for others. And that, she realized, was what authentic success had always been about. The months following the premiere of The Return brought changes that even Sarah hadn't anticipated. The film's message about authentic success and community transformation resonated far beyond her hometown, sparking a national conversation about alternative approaches to economic development and individual fulfillment. Within weeks of the film's release, Sarah was receiving calls from mayors, economic development officials, and community leaders from across the country who wanted to understand how they could implement similar strategies in their own struggling communities. The requests were overwhelming, from former mining towns in West Virginia to agricultural communities in Iowa to urban neighborhoods in Detroit that were grappling with post-industrial economic realities. But the attention also brought unexpected challenges. Media coverage of Sarah's success and her hometown's transformation attracted criticism from some quarters. A prominent business magazine published an article titled, "The Myth of Creative Economy's Salvation," arguing that Sarah's model was an isolated success story that couldn't be replicated at scale, and that promoting such approaches gave false hope to communities that needed more practical solutions. The article stung because it echoed the same skepticism Sarah had faced from her family years earlier. The critics argued that her success was largely due to luck, timing, and unique circumstances that couldn't be systematically reproduced. They contended that encouraging communities to invest in creative industries was irresponsible when more traditional economic development strategies offered more reliable outcomes. Sarah's initial impulse was to defend her work and prove the critics wrong. But she had learned over the years that sustainable change required addressing legitimate concerns rather than dismissing them. She began reaching out to the economists and policy experts who had questioned her approaches, seeking to understand their perspectives and find common ground. One of these conversations led to an unexpected collaboration. Dr. Michael Thompson, the economist who had written the critical article, agreed to conduct a rigorous academic study of Sarah's model and its broader applicability. The study would examine not just the successes she had achieved, but also the conditions that had made those successes possible, and the challenges that other communities might face in implementing similar approaches. The research project took 18 months and involved detailed analysis of economic data, surveys of community members, interviews with business owners and employees, and comparison studies with other communities that had attempted similar initiatives. Dr. Thompson's team also examined several attempts to replicate Sarah's model that had been less successful, trying to understand what factors determined success or failure. The study's findings were more nuanced than either Sarah or her critics had expected. The research confirmed that creative economy initiatives could generate significant economic and social benefits, but it also identified specific conditions that were necessary for success: existing cultural assets that could be built upon, leadership that could navigate both creative and business challenges, access to capital and markets, and community buy-in that went beyond just political support. More importantly, the study revealed that the most successful creative economy initiatives weren't just about attracting outside investment or copying successful models from other places. They were about identifying and developing authentic local assets and capabilities that could create unique value in regional, national, or global markets. What makes Sarah's approach work isn't that she created a film industry in a small town, Dr. Thompson explained during the study's release presentation. It's that she found ways to translate local assets, including underutilized human talent, available infrastructure, and community relationships into enterprises that could compete effectively in creative markets. The study's validation of Sarah's core principles led to new opportunities for collaboration and expansion. The Federal Economic Development Administration commissioned Sarah to develop a comprehensive framework for creative economy development that could be adapted by communities with different assets and challenges. The framework, called Asset-Based Creative Development, emphasized starting with what communities already had rather than trying to import successful models from elsewhere. It provided tools for identifying local, cultural, human, and physical assets that could be developed into creative enterprises, strategies for building the business and marketing capabilities needed to succeed in competitive markets, and methods for ensuring that creative development benefited existing residents rather than displacing them. But perhaps most importantly, the framework emphasized the importance of authentic leadership. Individuals who were genuinely committed to both creative excellence and community benefit, rather than outside consultants or developers who might extract value without providing lasting benefits. The framework was pilot tested in 12 communities across the country, each with different economic histories, cultural assets, and demographic characteristics. The results varied significantly, but several communities achieved remarkable transformations that validated the core principles while demonstrating how they could be adapted to different contexts. One of the most successful implementations was in a former logging town in Oregon, where a group of local artists and craftspeople had been struggling to make living wages from their work. Using the framework, they developed a cooperative enterprise that combined traditional woodworking skills with contemporary design sensibilities, creating furniture and architectural elements that were marketed to high-end customers in major metropolitan areas. The cooperative model allowed individual artisans to maintain their creative independence while benefiting from shared marketing, business development, and distribution capabilities. Within 3 years, the cooperative was generating millions of dollars in revenue and had created dozens of jobs that allowed skilled workers to remain in the community rather than relocating to urban areas. Another successful implementation occurred in a predominantly Latino neighborhood in Phoenix, where community members had been organizing around immigration rights and cultural preservation. The framework helped them develop a cultural center that combined arts programming with social services, language education, and small business incubation. The center became a hub for cultural tourism that celebrated Latino heritage, while also serving as a resource for community members who were starting their own businesses or pursuing educational opportunities. The combination of cultural programming and economic development created a sustainable funding model while strengthening community identity and cohesion. But the framework also revealed the limitations of creative economy approaches. Several pilot communities struggled to generate sufficient revenue to sustain their initiatives, particularly in areas where local purchasing power was limited, and transportation costs made it difficult to reach external markets. Other communities faced resistance from residents who were skeptical of change or worried that creative development would lead to gentrification and displacement. These mixed results led Sarah to a deeper understanding of the complexities involved in community development and economic transformation. She realized that her own success had been built on a combination of personal preparation, market timing, family support, and community assets that weren't present in all situations. This recognition led to her next major initiative, the development of what she called graduated development strategies that could support communities regardless of their starting conditions or assets. Instead of promoting a single model for creative economy development, the strategies provided multiple pathways that communities could pursue based on their specific circumstances and capabilities. For communities with strong existing cultural assets and access to markets, the strategies focused on scaling up creative enterprises and developing professional capabilities. For communities with limited assets or market access, the strategies emphasized building foundational capabilities and developing local markets before attempting to compete in external markets. But all the strategies shared common principles: respect for existing community assets and relationships, commitment to inclusive development that benefited current residents, emphasis on authentic rather than imported cultural expressions, and recognition that sustainable development required long-term commitment rather than quick fixes. The development of these nuanced strategies required Sarah to work with a broader range of experts and community leaders than she had previously engaged. She began collaborating with anthropologists who understood cultural preservation, sociologists who studied community change, urban planners who specialized in inclusive development, and business strategists who worked with cooperative and social enterprises. These collaborations expanded Sarah's understanding of the intersection between individual authenticity and community development. She learned that sustainable change required not just supporting individual entrepreneurs but also building community institutions and social infrastructure that could support ongoing innovation and adaptation. This broader perspective influenced Sarah's approach to her next major project: the development of a comprehensive educational program that would prepare young people to become leaders in community-based creative development. The program would combine traditional business and creative skills with training in community organizing, cultural preservation, and social innovation. The program, offered through a partnership between Sarah's Institute and several universities, attracted students from diverse backgrounds who shared a commitment to using their talents for community benefit rather than just personal advancement. The curriculum combined rigorous academic study with hands-on experience working on real community development projects. One of the program's most innovative features was its emphasis on what Sarah called bicultural competence, the ability to navigate both creative industries and community development contexts effectively. Students learned not just how to create excellent artistic work or build successful businesses, but also how to engage authentically with communities, respect local knowledge and values, and build enterprises that strengthened rather than disrupted existing social networks. The program's first graduates were remarkably successful at creating enterprises that combined creative excellence with community benefit. They started cooperatives, social enterprises, and nonprofit organizations that addressed local needs while generating revenue and creating jobs. More importantly, they demonstrated that it was possible to build careers that were both personally fulfilling and socially beneficial. Maria Santos, Sarah's former intern who had become a program instructor, often reflected on how different her own journey might have been if such educational opportunities had existed when she was starting out. "When I was young, I thought I had to choose between helping my community and pursuing my creative dreams," Maria told a group of prospective students. This program teaches you that those aren't competing goals. They're complementary strategies for creating meaningful change. The success of the educational program attracted attention from international development organizations that were interested in adapting Sarah's approaches to global contexts. She was invited to consult on projects in countries where creative economy development was being promoted as a strategy for reducing poverty and preserving cultural heritage. These international engagements provided Sarah with new perspectives on the relationship between individual authenticity and collective prosperity. She learned that the principles she had discovered through her own journey were indeed universal, but that their application varied significantly based on local economic conditions, cultural values, and political systems. In rural Guatemala, Sarah worked with indigenous communities that were trying to preserve traditional textile techniques while generating income through contemporary markets. The challenge was finding ways to maintain cultural authenticity while adapting to global consumer preferences and distribution systems. In Ghana, she collaborated with young entrepreneurs who were using technology to create new forms of musical expression that combined traditional African rhythms with contemporary electronic production. The project required navigating between respect for cultural heritage and innovation that appealed to international audiences. These international projects reinforced Sarah's belief that authentic success required deep understanding of local contexts rather than application of universal formulas. Each community needed to find its own way of balancing tradition and innovation, individual achievement and collective benefit, local identity and global connection. But the international work also revealed the broader significance of the principles Sarah had been developing. In an interconnected world where traditional economic models were creating increasing inequality and environmental degradation, communities everywhere were looking for alternatives that could provide prosperity without sacrificing cultural identity or social cohesion. Sarah's approaches offered a model for how individual authenticity could contribute to collective resilience rather than just personal advancement. By supporting people in developing their unique talents and interests, communities could build diverse economies that were less vulnerable to external disruptions and more responsive to local needs and values. This recognition led to Sarah being invited to speak at international forums on sustainable development, cultural preservation, and economic innovation. Her message was always the same: The most sustainable forms of prosperity were those that built on authentic local assets and capabilities, rather than trying to imitate successful models from other contexts. But the international recognition also created new pressures and expectations that challenged Sarah's commitment to staying grounded in her home community and core values. She was offered lucrative consulting contracts, invited to relocate to major metropolitan areas, and encouraged to scale her approaches through large-scale development projects. The temptations were significant, particularly as Sarah entered her mid-40s and began thinking about her long-term financial security and legacy. The international development work was intellectually stimulating and financially rewarding, but it also required extensive travel and pulled her away from the local relationships and commitments that had been the foundation of her success. The decision point came when Sarah was offered the position of director for a new international foundation focused on creative economy development. The role would involve overseeing hundreds of millions of dollars in development funding and managing projects in dozens of countries. It was the kind of position that represented the pinnacle of success in the international development field. But accepting the position would require relocating to Washington, D.C., and shifting from community-based work to policy and funding decisions made at a global scale. Sarah would be making decisions about communities she had never visited, and implementing strategies developed by people who had never lived in the places they were trying to help. The offer forced Sarah to confront fundamental questions about her values and priorities. Was her greatest contribution helping as many communities as possible through large-scale policy and funding decisions? Or was it continuing to work intensively with specific communities, while training others to adapt her approaches to their own contexts? After extensive consultation with her family, colleagues, and community members, Sarah made a decision that surprised many of the international development experts who had been following her work. She declined the foundation position and instead proposed a different model for scaling her impact. Rather than centralizing creative economy development through a large international organization, Sarah advocated for what she called distributed expertise, a network of locally based practitioners who could adapt her principles to their specific contexts while maintaining connection to a broader community of practice. The network would provide resources, training, and peer support for community-based creative development leaders, but it would be governed by the practitioners themselves rather than by external experts or funding organizations. Each node in the network would maintain autonomy and local accountability while contributing to collective learning and innovation. The first regional networks were established in North America, Europe, and Latin America, with plans for expansion to Africa and Asia as local leadership emerged. Each network was designed to reflect regional values and priorities, while maintaining commitment to the core principles of authentic asset-based development. The network model allowed Sarah to contribute to global conversations about creative economy development, while maintaining her base in her hometown and her focus on intensive local work. She could share her expertise and learn from others without becoming disconnected from the community relationships that had been essential to her success. But perhaps most importantly, the network model embodied the same principles that had guided Sarah's individual journey: authentic development based on existing assets and capabilities, collaborative rather than competitive relationships, and long-term commitment to sustainable impact rather than short-term results. As the network grew and evolved, Sarah found herself in a new role as an elder and mentor rather than a direct service provider. Younger practitioners were taking leadership in developing innovative approaches to community-based creative development, while Sarah focused on documenting lessons learned and supporting emerging leaders. This transition felt natural and appropriate. Sarah had learned that sustainable impact required building systems that could evolve and adapt, rather than depending on any individual leader. Her greatest contribution wasn't her specific techniques or strategies, but her demonstration that individual authenticity and collective prosperity could be mutually reinforcing rather than competing values. The recognition of this principle was reflected in the honor Sarah valued most: being invited to give the keynote address at her hometown's first annual Authentic Success Festival, a celebration of local entrepreneurs, artists, and community leaders who were creating value by being genuinely themselves. Standing on a stage erected in the town square looking out at an audience that included family members, former classmates, current colleagues, scholarship recipients, and visitors from around the world, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a young woman leaving home with impossible dreams to a community elder whose work was inspiring similar efforts globally. 20 years ago, I left this town because I thought I had to choose between following my dreams and staying connected to my community, Sarah told the audience. What I learned is that the most powerful dreams are those that create space for other people's dreams too. She continued, authentic success isn't about proving you're better than anyone else or escaping the limitations of your circumstances. It's about finding ways to contribute your unique gifts while creating opportunities for others to contribute theirs. Sarah concluded her speech with a challenge that reflected everything she had learned about the relationship between individual authenticity and collective prosperity. Don't just ask what success looks like for you. Ask what success looks like for everyone whose lives you touch. The most authentic success is the kind that makes everyone around you more successful too. After the festival, Sarah returned to her home office, the same room with the large window where she had first dreamed of making movies that mattered. The view outside had changed dramatically. The downtown area was now bustling with creative businesses. The former factory buildings had been converted into studios and makerspaces, and young families were walking streets that had once seemed destined for continued decline. But the most meaningful change was internal. Sarah had discovered that the most satisfying success wasn't individual achievement but collective transformation. The girl who had left home to prove her family wrong had returned to prove that everyone's definition of success could be expanded to include possibilities they had never imagined. Her family's weekly dinners now included not just relatives but also colleagues, mentors, scholarship recipients, and visiting practitioners from the international network. The conversations were rich with stories of creative problem-solving, community innovation, and collaborative achievement that would have been impossible to imagine when Sarah first left home with her single suitcase and impossible dreams. Kevin, now a successful consultant who specialized in helping traditional businesses adapt to changing markets, often joked about his early skepticism regarding Sarah's career choices. "I used to think she was crazy for betting everything on herself," he would tell visitors. "Now I realize she was crazy for not betting even more." Lisa had become one of the region's most successful accountants by specializing in creative enterprises and cooperative businesses. Her work had become essential to the ecosystem Sarah had helped create, and she often credited her sister with teaching her that business success and social impact could be complementary rather than competing values. Their parents, now in their 80s, had become informal ambassadors for supporting young people's unconventional dreams. They spoke regularly at local schools and community organizations about the importance of believing in potential, even when it didn't look like traditional success. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of Sarah's journey came from the next generation. The children who had grown up in the transformed community were now entering college and starting careers with very different assumptions about work and success than their parents had held. They expected to find careers that matched their interests and values. They saw entrepreneurship and creative problem-solving as normal responses to challenges, rather than risky departures from conventional wisdom. They understood that individual success and community benefit could be mutually reinforcing rather than competing goals. One of these young people, Elena Martinez, the daughter of one of Sarah's first scholarship recipients, had recently graduated from college with plans to start a social enterprise focused on sustainable agriculture. Elena's business plan combined her environmental science education with her family's agricultural heritage and her community's need for fresh, affordable food. "I never thought I had to choose between following my passion and helping my community," Elena told Sarah during a mentoring session. "Growing up here, I learned that the best way to help your community is to become the most authentic version of yourself." Conversations like this one reminded Sarah that her most important legacy wasn't the businesses she had built or the policies she had influenced, but the expanded sense of possibility she had helped create for future generations. As Sarah entered her 50s, she began working on what would become her final major project, a comprehensive memoir that would document not just her individual journey, but the collective transformation that had occurred when one person's authentic success created opportunities for an entire community to reimagine what prosperity could look like. The book, titled "Coming Home: How Authentic Success Creates Collective Prosperity," would combine personal narrative with practical guidance for individuals and communities that wanted to pursue similar transformations. But more than a how-to guide, it would be a meditation on the relationship between individual fulfillment and collective flourishing. Sarah spent 3 years researching and writing the book, interviewing hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her work and documenting the long-term impacts of community-based creative development. The process helped her understand that her story was part of a much larger movement of people who were choosing authenticity over convention and collaboration over competition. On the day she submitted the final manuscript to her publisher, Sarah received a text message from her brother Kevin. "Just got the call. My daughter was accepted to film school. She said she wants to, quote, follow the family tradition of proving everyone wrong by being right all along. Guess we're all learning from your example now." Sarah smiled, looking out the same window where her journey had begun decades earlier. The girl who had left home because her family laughed at her dreams had returned to create a world where no one had to choose between following their heart and taking care of the people they loved. The laughter had turned to gratitude, the skepticism to support, and the fear of financial insecurity to the knowledge that authentic success was the most reliable kind of all. Sometimes the best way to prove your family wrong is to prove that everyone can be right when they're brave enough to be themselves. The end.